Well, Dan Abrahams, welcome to Play Fearless.
Dan, thank you for having me on.
I'm, as we were talking just before we clicked a record here, I've been keen to get you on for a while, and I've held off, but then literally just last week, I thought I'd reach out and bring you on because I've become an avid listener of your podcast, the Sports Psych Show, which there will be a link in the comments here. So please make sure you go and check out Dan's podcast after hearing him chat here. But I thought I want to turn the microphone around on you, sir, and rather than you hosting the incredible guests you have, I thought we'd put you in the hot seat, so to speak. So I came across you, obviously, as the host of the Sports Psych Show, but as you are prone to do with your guests, I want to take you back. I want to hear where it started, because I know that you did play a bit of golf, and then you've worked across a whole myriad of sports. So can you just, take us back to where it all started and how your career has kind of just developed over the past couple of decades, probably, or so.
Yeah, sure. Well, it actually started 28 years ago now when I left school and I became a professional golfer, although I spent a year or so as an amateur golfer honing my craft. And so I always say I have 28 years in high-performance sport because ultimately high-performance sport started for me as I left school and I was trying to become an elite professional golfer. I always had a passion for the psychological side of golf throughout my teenage years, actually. When I was 15, 16 years old, I was picking up books on sports psychology, which probably sounds quite bizarre, but I always felt it would help my golf. And then as I played and competed to not a great degree of success, I might add, I saw some sports psychologists, and so I suppose that broadened my interest in sports psychology. I then went on to qualify as a PGA golf coach, so I have both a playing and a coaching background, which is a neat combination. And as I was coaching the game, I really wanted to get some further qualifications, but I kind of had a yearning to test the waters when it came to sort of being a sports psychologist, if you like. So I went and did a degree in psychology, a master's degree in sports psychology. So I went a very traditional route, was supervised and became a fully qualified and registered sports psychologist 18 years ago, coming up for my 19th year. And as you've mentioned, I mean, I left the golf behind. And as you've mentioned, I've worked across a range of sports, although when I started out, I did feel that there was an importance to specialize in some sports because I really wanted to learn the language of specific sports and the specific challenges that players have. Now, I knew golf like the back of my hand. So that was always, I didn't really need to do any more there. I just needed to continue to work in that area. But I got involved in non-league football, soccer, here in England because I was always a big football, soccer fan, and I really had a yearning to work in that sport in quite a deep way. So I got involved in non-league, built up my knowledge base, built up my experiences, and over the last 18, 19 years, I've worked with half a dozen Premier League clubs, worked around the world, just come out of a 2-year stint with Feyenoord, the Dutch team where we won the Dutch Eredivisie and the Dutch Cup, and they've come to the fore recently because their head coach, Arne Slot, has taken over from Jurgen Klopp at Liverpool. I've written 4 books, one of them golf, 3 of them soccer psychology. Thankfully, one of them a few years ago, the former professional player Gareth Bale said that my book Soccer Tough changed his life. I'm not sure it changed his life, but it was very nice of him to say so.
Absolutely.
I certainly owe him a beer for that one. I've in golf. Let's go back to golf. I've worked extensively again on all tours. I was lead psychologist for England Golf 2013 to 16. My book on golf is Golf Tough. And then in other sports, I was lead psychologist for England Rugby going into the 2019 World Cup, working alongside Eddie Jones.
Yep.
I have been Aston Martin Formula One Sports Psych for the past couple of years. I work across motorsports, and really, to be quite honest with you, I've I've probably worked with players in just about every single sport, to be honest,
Yeah.
in some shape or form. Although I always come back to I specialise in golf and soccer.
Yeah.
Those would be my two main sports, but
Yeah.
done a lot of cross sports. So that's a sort of a potted biography. And just to build on what you said with the podcast, I've got a podcast now, which is actually literally, as we're recording now, we are about to celebrate our 6th birthday. And it's a great podcast. I'm a very average host, but we have very great guests, so that's what makes it great. And it's really a deep dive into the sports psychology sphere, week in, week out. They're trying to unpack some fairly complicated and complex theories and bring it alive for our audience. So, that gives you an idea as to who I am and what I've done.
Yeah, I would love. We're definitely going to get into just like the different nuances about the sports, because as you were sort of just rattling off, not only the variety of sports but the level at which you've been working. I was picturing it on like a kind of continuum where it's just very rudimentary. I'm sort of thinking of like the different kinds of pressures or the different kinds of mental skills that are required in a game like golf, for example, where it's less reactive. My words, less reactive than say soccer or Aston Martin Formula Racing. I mean, so I'll be fascinated to get into the differences, but also I'd be curious to. So I'm just sowing some seeds here. Curious to see any similarities. What things just happen to be true because you were dealing with humans. But before that, I just wanted to. Just actually talk about the podcast and one, just share why I found it so useful, and hopefully why everyone who listens to this will then go and dig it out and also find it useful. But two, ask you why you started it. And I might start there, actually. Why did you start the podcast?
Combination of factors, probably some selfish factors as well. To be honest with you, at that time I'd left England Rugby. I've never worked full time as a sports psychologist. I'm a consultant, but I'd left that consultancy and I just had a bit of open space, and I'd always wanted to give a podcast a go. So there was that initial feeling and thought there. I think as well, as a consultant, I've always been very mindful that I haven't had enough links with the academic world, with the sports psychology academic world. And so what I really wanted to do was not have an academic on every single week. There is a keen mix of sports psychology practitioners and coaches and even some competitors, although not very many. But I really wanted to interview academics because I know there's so much great sports psychology research out there that don't see the light of day. In part because academia requires scholars to write in a particular style that's not particularly conducive to reading and enjoying that reading. I have to. I don't suggest for 1 second I'm a particularly intelligent individual. I'm not daft, but I'm not overly intelligent, and I certainly have to read some papers through 4, 5, 6 times before I actually understand what on earth is going on there. And I don't think I exaggerate on some of them. So I really wanted to give sports psych academics a bit of a platform and just help them unpack this work to help the world of coaching and other sports psychs as well, but people across sport actually understand there's some great stuff out there that they're not using necessarily. And so that was a prime driver as well. And being honest, it was another medium by which I could get myself out there. And as a consultant, you're always looking to sell yourself, and that feels anathema to say that when you're a psychologist, but that's the world we live in. You're looking for platforms. So I think there was a range of reasons, to be honest with you, Dan.
Yeah, and it's but of it all, like because I've been on a similar journey. This is the second podcast project I've started. It's only a fledgling one, the Play Fearless one, but all of those reasons sort of dovetail with some of mine, which is like you're talking about research. For me, it was around trying to tell stories which haven't been heard before or experiences, but it was also to set, if you want to use that phrase, sell yourself, but doing it as an authentic a way as possible, like to really try and connect and get a community and just do it as an authentic and also learn. I think for me especially, it was about how can I get as much learning into it, and which as a consumer of podcasts is probably obvious, but I think as a host of the podcast as well, there's so many things that I've picked up just by asking questions, and hearing different takes on it. But to your podcast, this is how I put other people onto your podcast, right? And you can take this however you want, but this is what I say. I reckon in the past I was guilty of browsing podcast lists looking for names I knew, right? Oh, I've heard of him, heard of her. I'll listen to that, right? And what I usually found was I'd heard those stories before, or there was nothing particularly enlightening, or maybe there was a little glimmer of it. And I realised I had this aversion to listening to names I'd not heard of, right? But I've realised that almost every episode I've listened to of your podcast, I had not heard of your guest before. Yet I've walked away from each one of those podcasts going, oh, I've got to share that with someone. Oh, I've got an athlete who needs to hear that. I've got a coach who needs to hear that. And so, yeah, it's, if nothing else, it's like, one, I just thought I'd share that. But second of all, just a challenge to people if they're stuck in the same way I am of just, looking for things that you recognize as opposed to going to the places you don't.
Well, if I can come back at you there, I think that's a really interesting piece of feedback because, one thing you're very mindful of, I mean, there's podcasts out there, not that aren't the same, but kind of in the same space with people with little black contact books that are the envy of people like me. And obviously I'm in a situation as a sports psych where I'm blessed to work with some of the best players, some of the best coaches in the world. But, I'd like to think being ethical and the professional that I am, I wouldn't dream of necessarily asking them onto the podcast. I mean, maybe once or twice I have done. And when I was at AFC Bournemouth consulting, I asked Jermaine Defoe if he would come on. And but I rarely do. So it's interesting hearing what you're saying there, because it's like, actually, that disadvantage that I feel I have is also a strength, because you're inviting people on who don't necessarily have much of a platform, who haven't had much of an audience, but they've got some really interesting things to say. And so I think that's a really interesting piece of feedback. So thank you for that.
Yeah, no worries. So you mentioned in your potted biography that at 15 you were picking up sports psychology books. I'm thinking of I've got a 16-year-old son at home who's really serious about his sport, and he's digesting a lot of sports psychology, and I'm going to pop sports psychology, I might frame it as, or iterations of it, or diluted versions of it, obviously through the social media, a lot on Instagram, a lot of YouTube, that kind of stuff. And I'm curious just to sort of get your observation of how the acceptance, if that's the right word, or the normalization of sports psychology specifically, maybe psychology more broadly, right? But sports psychology specifically, how you have found, that sort of the barriers to entry when you're working with people. Have they dropped a little bit? Are people more receptive? Is it gone from go see Dan down the hall if you need to, but we won't tell anyone, to actually no, let's get Dan in a room and connect? And how have you seen that sort of just evolve?
Well, I think there's two threads to your question there. There's the popularity of it, and then there's the normalization of it. And to answer the first part with the popularity, I mean, let's think about what your son is doing. As you mentioned there, he's consuming sports psychology. Well, if you think about 2 decades ago, he couldn't have done that necessarily, at least not as dynamically, robustly, and as far-reaching as he can now. As you've said, he can go onto all of these social media platforms, video platforms, and actually consume this information. He can jump onto Amazon now, or any other. There are online retailers available, other online retailers available, where you can purchase books, and but it's at the click of a button, and it's so easy to find. It's findable now, and that proliferation of information is as a consequence of the internet as its main platform. And so your son can go and find this information. It's findable. And that's the main thing. And so the popularity has increased. And I think that goes hand in hand nowadays with, the competition that's out there. If you're serious about your sport and you're going to and you want to compete, and you're going to define competing as getting that extra edge, right? Because there's lots of different ways to, consider competing, for more participative ways right the way through to sort of more sort of motivational ways. People are looking for that information now to get the edge. There's so much competition out there. All sports are tend to be global games now. So you've got global competition if you're serious about the game. So you've got to look, and various terms have come into the popular conscious now in terms of, the 1% and the marginal gains and things like that. And so people are looking for these things. And as you said, you've got your own case study at home with your son. He's looking for those marginal gains. So that's the popularity side of things, and then the normalization side of things. I think references that, because more people are doing it, more people are talking about it, and so it becomes normalized. But you've got some other little dynamics going on in the world of sport that is normalizing sports psychology, or at least branches of sports psychology. So, for example, the NFL, and I don't know how long this has been for, but the NFL in America and the NBA in America, my understanding is that those governing bodies have mandated each franchise to have 12 hours of mental health support per week. That might have gone up, it might have gone down, I don't know, but that at least that existed. Or came into existence. And so what happens, these athletes who are very famous across the world are exposed to this. They're given opportunities to speak to somebody if they need to. So now all of a sudden, you jump on social media, you jump on X or any other social media, TikTok, and these athletes are talking about well-being and mental health. They're talking about their protocols, for doing for managing their mental health and their day-to-day well-being. Now, that's only a part of sports psychology, and I actually think, as a slight aside, there's an interesting dynamic where I think some of the most important aspects, which we might come on to, the performance psychology pieces, are being lost a little bit amidst the noise of everybody talking about well-being, mental health, which is really important. Nobody denies that, and I'm not denying that, but there's some other really good things that are being ignored. Again, we can talk more about that. But when these superstars are going on online and talking about these things, it is normalized, isn't it? If they're doing it, maybe I should be looking into this. I do it, and often, not always, but often, I have a good experience with it. And so, you talk and talk and talk about it. There's a just yesterday, there's an ex-footballer. He's only just retired. Charlie Austin, not a particularly globally famous name, but he was a Premier League player, and he's just had a diagnosis for ADHD, at the age of something like 37, and we live in a world now where, Charlie is, you're a born and bred Englishman. Charlie's your cheeky chappy southerner who's bit way, bit woe, by his own admission, and you wouldn't necessarily expect him to come out and start talking about ADHD, but he is. So all of these mini case studies are popping up and have done for a few years, and they just add up to the normalization, at least of this branch of sports psychology. So I think that's important. Now, just the last thing to say here, to speak to your notion of, when you're involved with clubs, when you're involved with sporting organisations, so you're still down the hallway somewhere, tucked, in a room, in a closet somewhere. I think the interesting dynamic at the moment, in my opinion, and through my lens of what's happening, is a lot of these sporting organisations still don't know what to do with us sports psychologists. They don't quite know what we offer. I think they've bought into the mental health and well-being piece, again, coming back to that. But there's other areas they're not necessarily utilising us as well. So I think there's an interesting juxtaposition here between every sporting organisation that everybody knows, your Manchester Uniteds and cities in football, your national teams in rugby and your big domestic rugby teams. You know, they know they need something and they need somebody. They need some support in certain areas that sports psychology offers. They don't necessarily know about other areas that sports psychology can offer, and they don't always know how this is best done. And so there is still an element of your office down the hallway in the broom cupboard tucked behind everything else. There's still a slight element of that. So it's a fairly complex scene at the moment.
Yeah. Does it? Because when I hear you say that, and you've rattled off the places you've worked, it is somewhat surprising to me, actually, to hear that your feeling is that they're still not quite sure. And I'm not sure whether you're talking about you personally or more broadly.
It's probably me. It's probably my problem.
But no, what I mean is, I'm not saying if you're speaking just to your experience or if more broadly, but imagine you did have the perfect set. The perfect setup. What is it that you think coaches or administrations are missing? Like, what is it that they don't quite get, that if they could get, you'd position yourself this way and this is how you'd operate?
Well, without throwing you too much corporate speak and sports psychology speak, macro, meso, micro. So if you think of a sporting organization, a club, if you like, and you think about it from the macro level, as sports psychologists, and different sports psychologists do different things. Granted, that is true, but what not a lot of people realize is we can work at the macro level, so the systemic level. We can help there from cultural aspects, environment, communication cross-departmentally, helping establish multidisciplinary teams, MDTs. There's a raft of things we can do systemically to help cultivate the kind of language and behaviors, mission statements, values, those kind of corporate speak stuff, but stuff that can be very, very important and probably is very important. So we can absolutely intervene there. So that's the macro structural level. On the mesosystemic level, so mesosystem being a piece of that macro. So usually the coaching staff down into and working on the teamwork, working on all that kind of stuff. We can help there. Now, it's popular to say as sports psychologists, we work with and through coaches. So that would be mesosystemic. I work with and through coaches to help them with teamwork and leadership and learning and performance plans, not tactical plans, but mental systems and mental structures that can be developed across the team. That is something that we can do, and something that always infuriates me. I'm a sports psychologist, right? I'm a sports psychologist because I'm well versed in sport. I'm well versed in coaching science. I'm pretty well versed in skill acquisition. And this comes back to my complaint earlier of we're digging ourselves too deep into the mental health and well-being hole, and we can't climb out of that now. Or it's feeling like that, and so we can't spread ourselves across these other areas, because I can add value to help coaching staff session design to help players to learn the tactics and the techniques that they are teaching those players. I'm a psychologist. Psychology is about learning, or learning is about psychology. So I can add value there. I can be involved on the grass with my boots on, if you like, contributing in sessions. Why not? Again, I would describe that as the mesosystemic level. So I can be involved at the group level in all kinds of different areas. And then there's the microsystemic level, which is sort of individual players, whether it's helping, coaching stuff with individual players, or it's whether me directly working with individual players. To me, that's imperative across a range of things, whether it's mental skills, again, learning, participation, engagement, those kind of things. So I think there's a whole raft of things, and I would throw throw the mental health and the well-being piece in as well, and again, you can work on those areas, macro, meso, micro, in those ways. But there's just a raft of things, and so the question is, how do you start to incorporate that into your organization? Where do you start? Because even I would put my hands up and say, well, can you tackle all of those things? You certainly can't at the beginning, but you can certainly over time impact each of those areas. And so it has to start somewhere. And with experience, you learn to negotiate with the leaders of that organization your best starting place. And that might be systemically, or it might be at the team level and the coaching level, or it might be with individual players. It just depends on context and what the organization wants or needs.
Where's your favorite place to work? Like on which level?
I like to get my hands dirty. I mean, I like all areas, but I like to get my hands dirty. I'm a sports psychologist. I like to get in and work with individual players. I like to work with coaching staff, and I like to help coaching staff work with players. I think I want to build consistent language, shared mental models around language and behavior that helps optimize mindset of individual players and the team. That to me is my favorite. But when you look at that and you get that right, in many respects, you would also work systemically as well, because you're talking about shared language and shared behavior. And that has to, if it's going to be effective, and this is what we got very right at Feyenoord, I think, at that time, that when that shared language proliferates across the organization, that's when it becomes very powerful. So in a way, you can't have one without the other if you're going to do it effectively. But I really like getting my hands dirty and getting in there into the mix with the players and the coaches and working at that level there.
And when you go in at that level, how do you determine? I mean, I think I kind of know some ways you might use, but how are you? I've touched on this before about the wide variety of sports you've worked with athletes, with athletes and with coaches. How long does it take you to figure out the needs, the wants, the gaps, the tools that are going to be useful here, the mental frameworks, the language frameworks that you've spoken about there? Yeah, how do you conceptualize that work? Is that something that you co-develop with them? Is it something that you diagnose and prescribe? I'm really keen to hear how you go about that.
Yeah, I think you've got to be patiently impatient, if that makes sense. I think you've got to find some low-hanging fruit pretty quickly. When I enter an organization, I'm entering for a reason. Often because it's through a contact, it's through somebody who said, look, will you come in and have a conversation with us to explore how we can utilize your services? So, for example, at Feyenoord, it was the head of performance who brought me in. And I think I'm using this as a case study because I think it's a really, really good one. And the head of performance had been a player himself. He's actually an Australian, and he'd been a player himself. And he'd read one of my books in his playing days, and they had been looking for some consultancy in this area. So we had a few Zooms and had some conversations with there was a dual head of performance, so the other head of performance and the head of sports science and medicine. And they just really invited me over because obviously it's in the Netherlands and I'm in England. So invited me over and it was deliver to the staff so that they can get a feel for what you've got to offer and have some conversations. So that was an opening there. But what they also did on that trip is, which I think is a really powerful, you're asking me where I look for openings, a really powerful thing to do is have one-to-ones with key members of the team. For example, senior players or leaders, if you like. So you can get a feel for them. You can listen to what they've got to say, where they feel that there are gaps and openings for improvement, as well as the coaching staff, listening to the coaching staff. And you can actually do a session. I did session with the captain and with another senior important player, and they got a feel for me. So it enabled the staff to go back to them and say, well, what did you think of Dad? Did you think that was a good session? Is that useful? So it's that those aren't the only way. How long does it take? How long is a piece of string? But I'm always mindful that I've got to grab hold of something straight away. So this comes back to somebody's brought me in. That's my first in. So I'm going to have performance conversations with that person, excuse me, and where I want that person to introduce me to somebody else who is influential. And then I want them to introduce me to somebody else, and then somebody else. So we're kind of broadening, whether those other people are players or they're other coaches. We're finding our low hanging fruit to start having performance conversations. As we have performance conversations, we can start to co-create what the initial consultancy looks like, whilst actually still doing some consultancy in that process as well. So I'm finding out where I can add value whilst adding value in that process, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does,
Ultimately, it's that annoying answer of it depends.
Yeah.
There's no
It's my
one
favourite
way.
answer, Dan. It's my favourite answer. It's
Yeah.
usually the answer.
Yeah, it really is. It really is. There's no one way, and you just have to accept that. And through experience, I think you become better. And I'm by no means perfect, but I think you become better at being able to weave your way through that maze.
So when you're talking about those performance conversations, I'm guessing then that you're touching on the stuff that you have said perhaps at the moment people are missing because they are perhaps hearing psychologist and thinking mental health well-being. So when you're having let's get into this stuff, because this is the stuff that I'm really keen to draw out on this podcast. So when you're having a performance conversation, are you talking about mental skills? Are you talking about confidence? Are you talking about pressure? Talk to us a little bit about the stuff that you think people aren't talking enough about.
Yeah. Look, first things first, meet people where they're at. So if somebody wants to have a performance conversation that is tailored towards mental health and well-being, provided my competence stretches to that conversation, because obviously there's some things around mental health that as a sports psychologist, I would have to refer on to a clinical psychologist. I'm very happy to have that conversation. So I think the first thing to say is you've got to meet people with, where they're at, what conversation they might want to have. If that sketch pad isn't filled in and you can have any kind of conversation, my first orientation is usually towards mental skills. Now, I'm taking a very broad definition of mental skills, in essence, competitive mental skills, which could be extraordinarily broad. It's not just the classic psychological skills training of attention, relaxation, goal setting, imagery, etc. I want to have a rich conversation about what players are doing from a mental standpoint to be able to compete. By compete, I mean to high perform consistently under pressure. I'm passionate for my experiences. I rarely come across players, and I'm talking about some of the best in the world here that I've spoken with and worked with. I rarely come across a player who can really articulate a mental game plan, a mental playbook, if you like, in order to help them become better competitors. That's not to suggest they don't exist out there, but and it's not to suggest there's not a continuum here with some players who have a lot of it filled in and some players having a little bit filled in, but very many, there's tumbleweed floating across the ground when you ask them what they're trying to achieve mentally when they go and compete. There often is. And so I find this very, very interesting. And also then from a team perspective, there's often very little in place from a team high performance mindset perspective. So again, that can be an entrance point there. But to speak to your question, my first port of call, and this is just me, is usually in the direction of mental skills, and I tend to, we all have our own approach and our own language, and I'd like to think mine is robust and broad and deep, but I often orient back towards these notions of high performance mindset and low performance mindset. And do your players know how to compete in their high performance mindset? Do they have specific tools, techniques, approaches to help them do that as individuals and as teammates? Is there and from a team perspective, is there a shared language here? Is this introduced and delivered on the training ground? Are the coaches all in on this? Is there a shared language? Is there a shared language between the coaches and the players? Is this utilized in the gym? Are these conversations being had, and is this language used in the video suite, the video room? Is this being reinforced in team talks? What about in small group meetings? What about in one-to-ones between coaches and players and watching video footage? Is there a shared language here for mindset, for high performance mindsets? Do the players know what the individual mental frameworks are? That often, if I'm talking to, I suppose, senior leaders, coaches in the organization first, those are the kind of questions that I'm asking, and extensions to those. If we're talking, we've spoken about the performance piece there. The extension to those would be the learning piece. How are you helping your players learn? If you want them to be great competitors, then you need to be involved in sophisticated skill development protocols, within your sessions. How are you doing that? What mental tools are you using to improve your skill acquisition, the skill acquisition of your players? How are you helping them prepare for game day, not just from a mental skills perspective, but from learning the tactical area of the game? So there's so many branches off of mental skills, and that's why I think it's quite a broad area for conversation. And I think a lot of these questions aren't filled in; they're not answered in a lot of these organisations. You'd be very surprised.
Yeah.
And so that tends to be my first port of call.
Yeah, it's a similar way I sort of typically go in, and whether this is in a professional team or I do a lot of work with emerging athletes, and maybe going down a college pathway or chasing a career domestically, and you go into high performing programs and you say, okay, how important is the mental side of it? And all the hands go, well, 10 out of really important. They go, okay, show us your program. And it's crickets, right? There's nothing, and I think it's still surprising, but it's not surprising in the same time that we all know how important it is. But then, all those questions you just, rattled off, I imagine I can picture the coaches' faces. I can picture the players' faces where they're going, never even thought about this. I'm just doing it. And I find it really interesting that someone like yourself would work with such a wide range of athletes and competitors. And I appreciate we have got nowhere near enough time to talk about the nuances between each and every one of them. So I'd like to go the other way. And I'd like to, rather than talk about the differences between athletes, I'm curious if there's any truisms, because people are like people. Once you put yourself in that kind of arena, these things crop up, and these things are things that you need to be able to manage, navigate, if you're going to work out what you're capable of.
Yeah, sure. And this is the theme of my next book, actually, that I'm keenly writing, and hopefully will have out by at least the end of October. And you talked about a truism there, and one could argue there's no truism in psychology, but I'm going to throw you three things here that I think are ever present on the pitch or the court or the course, that I think you can't really argue against them. Attention, intensity, intent. And I write a lot about this on LinkedIn and Facebook and the other platforms I use. Attention, intensity, intent. I don't think anybody can deny that a focus of attention is relevant. In fact, you would say that this is the seat of your learning in many respects, and it's the seat of performance. It's the number one thing. A focus of attention and staying connected to the game is absolutely imperative. Nobody can say attention doesn't exist or it's not important. So if we're talking about a truism, for me, attention is a truism in every activity, in every session, and in every game. Attention drives learning, because you can look at the implicit learning literature, okay, granted, but when we're talking about explicit learning, then you're not going to learn what you're not paying attention to. So captivating somebody's attention, or somebody driving their own attention onto the world and the specific things that they want to learn, that's imperative. You're not gonna develop skill without paying attention. And then on if we're talking about, let's say, soccer here on the pitch, you've got to stay connected. You've got to keep a focus of attention and stay connected to the game. By connected, I mean you've got to stay connected to your teammates, their actions, their movements, their decisions. You've got to stay connected to the opposition, their actions, their decisions, their movements. You've got to stay connected to where the ball is, where the space is, the relationship between the opposition, your teammates, the ball, the space. You've got to stay connected to the responsibilities in your role, any specific actions you want to execute. You've got to stay connected to anything that's important to you in that game. So there's a raft of things that you've got to stay connected to, and you can easily become distracted and disconnected from the game. So attention is a truism for me. The next mental skill is intensity. By intensity, and there's different words used here by psychologists, but I like the word activation. Just as we have physical activation, so we have mental activation. So I want to be mentally activated, alert and ready, or ready and alert, and if I'm not that, not only am I going to become distracted and disconnected, or become disconnected from the game, but I'm not going to be able to anticipate and make decisions. So the intellectual side of the game gets lost, anticipation and decision making. So that's very linked to intensity. And what we know, whether through the research literature or whether just through what we know from the experiential data, what we experience in sport, is if our mental activation is too high, there's various things that are going to happen. We're going to run around like a headless chicken, or we're not going to make very effective decisions. We're not going to be able to see the granular detail of what's around us. If our mental activation is too low, we're going to play lethargic and flat and slow, and we're not going to be first to the ball and first into space. We're not going to be able to coordinate our muscles as well and be able to execute our technique. So to me, intensity is a truism, and that final one is intent. And really, intent is the execution. The execution of actions. So we want a positive execution of actions. We want to be purposeful and proactive. We want energy forward. We want to be on the front foot, essentially. Whereas if we've got a negative execution of actions where we're hesitant and we're a little bit passive, well, we certainly don't want those. So intent, to me, I think intent really comes under the literature on approach behavior, approach versus avoidant behavior, which has a very evolutionary feel to it. So, we want to, when we're in playing mode, we want to be by and large in approach mode and not avoidant mode.
Yeah.
So, attention, intensity.
So just for those who aren't across that, so we want to be going towards the win rather than trying to avoid the loss, or we want to be. Is that fair to say? Or we're taking on
that could be one way to look at it. I mean, I don't think it's a truism. I think a check and challenge there would be. I don't think it's a truism that we want to be towards the win and away from the loss all the time, because I don't think there's anything wrong with an analysis around what does it look like away from the loss. But by and large, I would say you want to play towards the win. Approach behavior for me is more the positive execution of actions and being purposeful and proactive, as opposed to being hesitant and passive. That's the way I would define it. But you are absolutely correct. I think what I like about what you said there is towards and away from are very nice and simple illustrations of approach and avoidant behavior. Absolutely.
And so, because I'm curious about particularly around the attention piece, and so this would be a good opportunity for a check and challenge as well, perhaps. would I be right in saying if I can train that attention, or if I can get the athletes, the coaches to train that attention, it's going to help me almost. I'm not sure quite the way, but it could almost serve as like an antidote to pressure, because if my attention is out of that moment, then that's when the thoughts of the mistakes I've made, or the time's running out, or we're going to lose. Is that fair to say? Would it help me tackle this concept of pressure?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the interesting thing about these three mental skills is that they can be treated in an isolated manner, and they can be treated in an integrated manner. They mesh together. So when I think of pressure, under pressure, I experience thoughts, emotions, and feelings that might be construed as negative. And so I would largely talk about the intensity piece there, that under pressure, during performance anxiety, I might rise too high in activation, which does all kinds of nefarious things to my performance. So I think, first and foremost, you might explore areas to cool down your activation, bring it down. That can be things like breathing, it can be things like self-talk, it can be imagery, and various different techniques, right? Equally, under pressure, to speak to your point, completely correct. When I have thoughts, emotions, and feelings that are negative due to pressure, that's fine. That's no problem at all. But I want to shift my attention away from focusing on those thoughts, emotions, feelings, onto staying connected with the game. And, this comes very much under the literature of focus of attention being in most team sports, you'd want to have an external focus of attention most of the time. Under pressure, okay, my attention might turn inwards into the feelings of pressure or the thoughts around pressure. And I might be very conscious of that. And so I become very conscious of executing my actions. And a way to overcome that is to make sure my focus of attention is pointing outwards onto the field of play, onto where are the opposition, where are my teammates, focusing on my next action. So focusing my attention externally. So absolutely, that focus of attention can help you to manage pressure. Manage performance anxiety.
Yeah. And when I'm back where we started, sort of comparing or considering different sports, like in sports that you've worked, like rugby, soccer, race car driving, there's not much time to think, right? So there's not much time and so I'm curious about how that still might manifest, even though I'm driving at 200 miles an hour, or even though I've got, the All Blacks running at me or whatever. And so I'm curious about how it might manifest there. But then, and as a very, very poor golfer myself, and I mean poor, I find there's so much time to think on there. And it's like, can you help me understand the impact of time and what athletes can be doing to manage that time? We talk about time management all the time in the corporate world, but as an athlete, how do we manage our time when it comes to things like pressure and attention and the kind of things that we've been talking about?
Yeah, look, I think it's a really interesting landscape here, and I don't deny a sport like golf feels more psychological because there's plenty of time to, as you say, think, and that's what a lot of people will say. Let's go back to this idea that as a human being, in very simple terms, and I mean very simple terms, underneath the surface, underneath the bonnet, are thoughts, emotions, feelings. Let's simplify it. We all consist of thoughts, emotions, feelings. And when we think about having a tendency to get in our own way, that's often because of thoughts, emotions, feelings that are arising. Now, when somebody says to me, well, there's not a lot of time during these team invasion sports like football, soccer, rugby to a degree, but rugby is interesting because there's a lot of stopping and starting. But if you think about a boxer in the ring, or UFC fighter in the octagon, or all these kind of sports, which is football, soccer being probably the main one, basketball another one in play, people will say, well, there's not a lot of time to think. Now, here's the thing, is that thoughts, emotions, feelings, thoughts work in milliseconds, and we're constantly experiencing feelings, right? Feelings are always there. Even if they're in a neutral mode, feelings are always happening. And there's a process called interoception, where our body is communicating with our brain, and our brain is communicating with our body, and there's this constant back and to, and the feelings that we experience are the brain's interpretation of data being sent back from our body. This is always happening, and those things shape our emotions, and often shape our emotions as a consequence of the thoughts we experience. But in many respects, if we say football, soccer is a game of seconds, thoughts, emotions, feelings happen in milliseconds. We experience them in milliseconds. So I'm always careful to say there's certainly plenty of time to feel, because we're always feeling, and those feelings can shift instantly. And there is still time to think. We judge what's going on the pitch as we are competing. And so ultimately what we want to be able to, let's come back to this idea of attention. And you were quite right, to suggest this is a great antidote to pressure. Attention is a great antidote to the thoughts, emotions, feelings that we're experiencing. We want to place our attention appropriately as we compete during the game. But that is tough, because our thoughts, emotions, and feelings are constantly trying to capture our attention. The judgments that we experience, this isn't going well today. Wow, this striker is quick, so strong. I'm struggling to get near him. I don't fancy our chances today. This team are really quick, really strong. I just feel so awful today. I'm just not on it. My teammates are playing so poorly today. Our coach is going to bring me off. We have thoughts, emotions, and feelings that are constantly hitting our conscious awareness, and the battle there is to keep paying attention to the correct cues, clues, and triggers as they emerge, to be able to act on them. That is ultimately what we're trying to do, and we're trying to do that at an optimal intensity, mental activation, whilst we execute our actions positively, as in the intent piece. So that's the challenge. So stripping this back to what you're saying, that's my argument as to why athletes need these very simple, practical mental frameworks in order to deal not just with the external distractions, but the internal, the thoughts, emotions, and feelings that are hitting your conscious awareness. That's vital. And so that's happening on the pitch. Now in golf, yes, there's lots of time to think. So you can be experiencing those, and you're constantly judging the game and how it's going, and especially how your swing is feeling and where the ball is going. But don't forget, you can get to the top of your golf swing and have a thought, don't go left. You can be working the club into the golf ball, and as you're releasing the club through the golf ball, you can have a feeling of that ball going right and make a minor adjustment at the end. This is how quick we're functioning as human beings. So that's the psychology of golf in that 1 second, 1.5 seconds as the swing is being executed is ginormous. And that's why players need what I call ruthless routines. They need routines where they're building momentum of control going into the ball. That is absolutely imperative. So, especially to perform under pressure. So I think the way time plays out is different for different sports, but ultimately every sport requires these mental frameworks captured within mental routines, if you like, that enable you not just to deal with external distractions, but deal with internal distractions, compete at the right mental activation, intensity, and to compete whilst executing your actions positively. That's the intent piece. All of this is relevant.
So you've used the word there a couple of times, frameworks, and in my head I'm thinking we've got a framework there, And for that framework to really stand up and be sustainable, it needs to be, and go with me on this one, Dan, needs to be planted on a foundation, a strong foundation. And I'll just share with you the foundation I will always keep going back to is this idea of you're more than an athlete. So this sport is just something you do. It's not who you are. And I've heard you speak on your own podcast a lot around identity foreclosure and the importance of navigating that, challenging that. How, I know it's important. So how do you go about talking with athletes and coaches around that? Because I think a lot of people have actually, one, never really considered it, and two, when it does come up, it's almost, I don't know, that it's almost an affront to some at some points to say, "Hang on, you're not a footballer. You're someone who plays football." One, I'm wondering if you do subscribe to that first and foremost. I shouldn't assume you do, but I'm curious to hear, how you do approach that concept and whether it is you position it in the way I might, where it's actually this is where we're going to start. This is the foundation, and then the frameworks we build on top of that are going to be stronger and more sustainable.
Yeah. I don't know if I'd start there, but I definitely think it's built into, or I strive to build it into the conversation I'm having around the relationship somebody has with themselves in their sport, the participation piece here, and the relationship they have with outcome and performance. And I suppose it depends. The direction of conversation and where I start will determine how I start to incorporate the rationalization of themselves competing in their sport, and how and really the belief system they have around what outcome and performance means to them. Quite often, people have come to me because, and I'm sure you recognize this, because they've been underperforming. Not all the time, but sometimes they've been underperforming, and often it's because they have this very extreme black and white maladaptive approach to outcome and performance, and that's often related to this idea of, well, I'm Dan the footballer, and this is everything to me. This is my life, and I'm trying to be a professional. I'm trying to get as high as I can as a professional, and it's a disaster if I play poorly. It's the end of the world. And I think it's tough for those who are very ambitious, no matter their age and no matter their experience. It can be tough for those who are striving to discover how good they can be, because it naturally kind of feels like they have to be all or nothing. They have to be black and white. They have to take this extreme viewpoint. And I try to frame this in line with relationships with outcome and performance. And from that very basic notion of, well, look, the outcome is in the score, is in the result, is in winning and losing or position in the field. You can't really control that. We're going to tone that down a little bit by the language that you use, or by ignoring it completely. The language that you use being, I'd like to win here, and I'm doing what I can. I'm putting in place what I can to give myself the best opportunity to win or to finish high as I can in the field. And that's how I'm going to start to talk to myself about outcome. What lends itself to outcome is performance. Now, performance is slightly more complex in terms of how I view the lens of performance here. But what's important around performance is to recognize, and again, this is always drawing back to that identity piece, but perhaps in a slightly broader manner, which is, again, I want to do well, so I want to perform really well, but I recognize that even the best players in the world make mistakes. Even the best players in the world, sometimes a 6 out of 10 performance is a really good performance. I have to give up a bit of control around my performance. I have to be more as accepting of it as I can be. And I have to understand, it's important for me to understand that I can't force my performance, and actually forcing it can lead to all kinds of things that prevent me from performing. Now, I'm answering you like this because these tend to be more of my entrance points. And as you're talking about that, having that kind of conversation, it tends to stretch into, look, a part of what you're doing here, a part of your life, is being the footballer or being the golfer. And it's important to you that you give yourself your best opportunity to do well. But that's all you can do, is your best opportunity. And for you to turn down the volume of pressure, it's also useful for you to have other identities here or other things in your life that enable you to relax a little bit about performance, that enable you to come away from performance and take your mind and put your mind elsewhere and build your confidence as a human being, because you have other things and other strings to your bow, and so on and so forth. So I'm always trying to weave it into the narrative around competition and being involved in the game and learning the game. And then ultimately it comes back to, well, look, I'm Dan the golfer, and golf is really important to me. All I can do is the right things every day to be the best that I can be, and I can't ask for any more. What's also important in this process is me being Dan the husband, and Dan the son, and Dan the brother, and Dan and also what's important for me to give myself my best chance in my golf is to have other things in my life that help me get away from my golf. So it's just taking a slightly more sophisticated view of competition, but also participation in your sport. It's understanding that burnout and injury and other factors play a part in your experience of your sport, and the broader identities you have, the less chance that they will have a negative impact on your sport. I think it's a complex weaving into the experience of being involved in sport is how I would approach it.
Yeah. Well, Dan, that's a really excellent, I think, place to round this out. I want to thank you for coming on as a guest. You're incredibly speedy in your reply to come on, which I really did appreciate. But I mean, you've dropped so many thoughts there, frameworks, insights. So when people want to track you down, I've mentioned the podcast, but why don't you just take the floor, Dan, and where can people find you? Where's the best space to access all things Dan Abrahams?
Well, Dan, that's very generous of you. So thank you very much. And thank you for your time today. I really enjoyed the conversation. People can find me first and foremost on my website, danabrahams.com. And when you go on there, you can find all of my books and your ability to contact me through the contact form. If you're interested in following my work, you can find me in a raft of social media. I write every single day on LinkedIn and Facebook. LinkedIn, Dan Abrahams, and Facebook, Dan Abrahams Soccer. I'm on Instagram at Dan Abrahams Sport. I've got various accounts on X, the main one being at Dan Abrahams 77, at Dan Abrahams 77, giving my age away. As you've mentioned, Sports Psych Show. Just Google the Sports Psych Show and you will find that. That's my podcast. And that's me. So thank you very much for your time.
Well, thanks very much, Dan. And I look forward to engaging in, there's so many episodes for me to still get into on the Sports Psych Show, so I'll be endeavouring to do as best I can in the next few weeks. So thanks very much for coming on, and take care.
Thanks so much.